So here's another article that I think was worth commenting on. It was written shortly after The Last Jedi came out back in 2017. It's called Hate Last Jedi? The Star Wars Expanded Universe is Worse. It's written by Sean Buckley and is on cnet.com. A link to it will be in the description. Underneath the title is the contention of the article, stating, Star Wars was a bloated, cheesy mess long before Rian Johnson's new film came along. You know it to be true. It's a bold claim, and maybe some people really do feel that way. But personally, I'd have to disagree. In my opinion, the original Star Wars Expanded Universe wasn't entirely perfect, but for the most part, I think it's worthy of being in continuity with the original 6 movies. I can't directly comment on the quality of The Last Jedi because I haven't seen it, but I do know it's controversial, so many people love it and many people hate it. Sean never even really tries to defend The Last Jedi, but in the conclusion he mentions the purpose of his article. You don't need any reason to hate The Last Jedi. You don't have to like how it portrayed Luke Skywalker in his old age, or how it decided to wrap up, or outright dismiss the mysteries left over from The Force Awakens. If the film wasn't for you, that's the only excuse you need. But if your foundation for that excuse is the quality of the Star Wars Expanded Universe, you're standing on shaky ground. I'd have to say a majority of the complaints about The Last Jedi that I've heard don't even mention the EU. I made a video myself commenting on some of the big critiques of the film, and contrasted them to the Expanded Universe, just because I kept noticing that the big problems of the film, namely Luke's poor characterization, wasn't present in the EU. I'll also put a link in the description for that video. Anyway, if Sean is actually trying to defend The Last Jedi, deflecting criticism of it by saying, well, it's not as bad as the EU, is not addressing the people who hate The Last Jedi. I do believe Sean is genuine when he says this article was just for fun, and just wanted to poke some fun at Star Wars. He does admit that there are parts of the EU he does like, and he grew up with a lot of it, even holding some of it in high regard. With that being said, I might hesitate to call someone who wrote an article like this a fan of the EU, the title itself kind of implying that the Expanded Universe deserves more hate than The Last Jedi. But it does seem to be more clickbait than anything. I'm not going to say anything bad about Sean, or even say he is wrong for having the opinion he does, but I am still going to address all the points in his article. He writes, after the success of The Force Awakens and Rogue One, it's hard to imagine Star Wars The Last Jedi would become one of the most divisive films in the franchise. Yet here we are. The film has been in theaters for barely a week, and there's already a Change.org petition asking Disney to remove it from the official Star Wars canon and remake Episode 8 properly. Even the petition's creator admits the demand is patently ridiculous, though its absurdity lies not in the petition itself, but in its justification, that The Last Jedi needs to be culled from the Star Wars timeline because it doesn't live up to the expectations of fans of the comics and novels that make up the now-defunct Star Wars Expanded Universe. Sean is incorrect here. The petition mentions the EU, but doesn't use the quality of it as justification for the petition's existence. The guy who wrote the petition, Henry Walsh, states, Star Wars has long been a story about two things, the Jedi and Luke Skywalker. After over 260 novels where we could follow the adventures of that great hero, you, the Walt Disney Company, decided to strike all of that from the official canon and wiped out 3 decades of lore. We were excited to see Episode 7 to see how our heroes' lives turned out since you took away what we knew. We saw the death of Han Solo. We saw less than a minute of Luke Skywalker. Episode 8 was a travesty. It completely destroyed the legacy of Luke Skywalker and the Jedi. It destroyed the very reasons most of us, as fans, like Star Wars. This can be fixed. Just as you wiped out 30 years of stories, we ask you to wipe out one more. The Last Jedi. Remove it from canon. Push back Episode 9, and remake Episode 8 properly to redeem Luke Skywalker's legacy, integrity, and character. We stuck by you when you did things that hurt us before. So we ask you now, please don't let this film stand. Don't do this to us. Don't take away something so many of us love so much and destroy it like this. Let us keep our heroes. All Henry says about the EU is that Disney is so good at wiping things from official canon that it could do the same thing with The Last Jedi. It's not even explicitly saying Episode 7 was bad, or that the EU should be brought back or continued. Just that Episode 8 was so terrible that they want it remade. And 117,000 people have signed this petition, most of whom I would imagine are fans of the new canon. I mean, I don't follow Disney's canon, so for all I care, keep The Last Jedi in it. It doesn't affect me as an EU fan one way or the other. But it is a testament to just how many people despise this movie. I'd imagine that if this film was at worst considered just average by most people, a petition like this would have a hard time getting even 1,000 signatures. Anyway, going back to the article. Sean writes, "Guys, I grew up with reading those books too. They were pulpy, ridiculous fun. But that doesn't mean they were good. In fact, a lot of the Star Wars EU was really, really bad. Here are some of our favorite terrible stories from the Star Wars Expanded Universe." Then he writes spoiler warning for the EU stories he's about to critique. So I will also give a spoiler warning from here on out when I discuss Sean's reasons on why he considers a lot of the EU to be so bad. Remember that time Luke fell in love with the dead woman? In the novel Children of the Jedi, Luke gets trapped on an Imperial dreadnought where the spirit of a long-dead Jedi living in the ship's computer helps him open doors and hides from his attackers. Luke falls in love with a possessed spaceship computer and eventually starts dating her after she transfers her consciousness into the body of one of Skywalker's dying students. By comparison, Han and Leia's romance was pretty straightforward. Boy rescues girl, girl calls boy a nerf herder, boy gets frozen in carbonite, girl rescues boy. You know, a classic love story. So, like I said at the beginning, I don't think the EU is perfect, and Children of the Jedi is probably one of my least favorite novels. I'm not a huge fan of Barbara Hambly's writing, but I do think the concepts she brought up were very interesting, and maybe with a better writer, this story may have been one of my favorites. Callista Mansana was a Jedi Knight who sacrificed herself to transfer her spirit into this automated superweapon that continued to wreak devastation on the galaxy for decades. And Luke teaming up with his spirit to destroy the ship they are both trapped inside is very believable within the logic of the Star Wars universe. What I didn't quite buy into was them falling in love so quickly. I could see it happening maybe after Callista was transferred back into a human body, but maybe not right away. Maybe give it another book or two before I could really see a romantic relationship start to blossom. And I do think the second book of what fans call the Callista trilogy is way better. In Darksaber, she leaves Luke to try to reawaken the connection to the Force on her own. So, to the EU writers' credit, they seem to think the Callista story wasn't all that great either, and kind of wrote her out of the story. According to the Wikipedia behind-the-scenes section on Callista, they did something crazy and actually listened to the fans who wanted Mara Jade to be Luke's love interest instead. So if you were someone who truly hated the storyline, you don't really have to worry about it too much, because it only lasts 3 books, and I don't think it irreparably harmed Luke's whole character either. And I have to give the EU writers even more credit, because it's not like they just pretend the storyline never happened. Callista still pops up in some short stories or Clone Wars era novels. Admittedly, it's a silly and weird storyline on the surface, but I think it fits within the Star Wars universe, treats the characters within it fairly well, and doesn't overstay its welcome. How about when Emperor Palpatine cloned himself dozens of times? Luke's girlfriend isn't the only one who made a habit of leaping from body to body. In the Star Wars Dark Empire comics, Darth Vader's final sacrifice was rendered moot when it was revealed the Emperor had a stronghold of clone bodies to transfer his soul into after the destruction of the second Death Star. Oh, and Luke was so impressed by Emperor Palpatine's immortality, he turned to the dark side for a while. Neat. I think talking about the Dark Empire comics is worth its own future video, especially with the points that Sean brings up here, because everyone who criticizes Dark Empire keeps bringing up the same things. No, Darth Vader's sacrifice wasn't rendered moot when he killed Palpatine. For one thing, Vader didn't sacrifice himself primarily to kill Palpatine. He did it to save his son. How could Vader's sacrifice be pointless if Luke is alive? If he didn't do anything, Luke would be dead. Also, within the EU, Palpatine's death on Endor set the Empire on a downward spiral, bringing about the era of squabbling warlords trying to seize power, and eventually causing the Empire to cannibalize itself. The New Republic wouldn't have gotten the foothold it did if Palpatine survived that battle. The only reason Palpatine didn't immediately come out of hiding after the second Death Star was so that he could build up his army in secret, manipulating things from the shadows like Palpatine does best, and then leading a devastating assault on the galaxy once the time was right. And Palpatine using clone bodies to house his spirit also makes complete sense within the context of Star Wars. Palpatine is the strongest Sith Lord in history, and is obsessed with ruling the galaxy forever. With his powers and advanced cloning technology at his disposal, why wouldn't he create several clones of himself to live forever? Palpatine is a megalomaniac who basically thinks he's a god. Maybe at the time the story came out, the whole Palpatine coming back to life just seemed like a gimmick to bring back a recognizable villain, to boost comic sales or whatever, but honestly, as the EU went on, the scheme that Palpatine had to come back to life made more and more sense. We saw more examples of powerful Sith Lords from the Old Republic try to cheat death by transferring their spirit into different bodies. It would just make sense for Palpatine to follow that example to try to gain immortality for himself. In the Darth Plagueis novel, Plagueis mentions the idea of using clone bodies as a means of gaining eternal life. In the Republic Commando novels, Palpatine actively tries to use the cloning technology for his own selfish purposes. And in Revenge of the Sith, we see Palpatine talking about how he would work together with Anakin to discover the power to overcome death. Finally, about the whole Luke turning to the dark side thing, the reason he did so was that he believed he could defeat Palpatine from the inside. He even managed to gain access to the codes to stop Palpatine's World Devastator superweapons. But by even pretending to go to the dark side to stop Palpatine was enough to immerse him in darkness, and he fell for the same trap that Quinlan Vos or Ulic Qel-Droma did by believing they could skim the dark side without falling into it. Luckily for Luke, he had Leia to pull him back to the light side, so they could defeat Palpatine using the Force and turn his attack on himself. I don't know how that's worse than Luke trying to kill his nephew in his sleep, and then retreating from the galaxy to become a suicidal hermit, but you all can tell me that in the comment section. Also, this story was suggested and approved by George Lucas himself. What about the endless march of Death Star clones? Did I mention both the above stories revolve around Death Star-like superweapons? They do. The EU is littered with planet-killer wannabes. There's Centerpoint Station's planet and star-destroying hyperspace tractor beam, the particle disintegrator warheads fired from the planet-killing galaxy gun, the mass shadow generator's ability to crack a planet's crust through gravity manipulation, and the invincible solar system-destroying Sun Crusher. There's dozens more too, and that's not even counting weapons like the Darksaber or Conqueror, which just cram the original Death Star's laser onto other spaceships. And you thought the Force Awakens Starkiller Base was uncreative. I think the reason people criticize Starkiller Base, more than they do superweapons in general, was that a common complaint of The Force Awakens was that it was a ripoff of A New Hope, which is compounded by the fact that it ended with a space battle on Starkiller Base, which looks very much like the Death Star on top of everything else. I mean, Starkiller Base is still far more creative than the Death Star 2, because that's just a literal copy of the superweapon from the first movie. The reason that people don't criticize the Death Star 2 as much as Starkiller Base was because Return of the Jedi actually had an original story. If the plot of Return of the Jedi just copied A New Hope, people would probably lambast the Death Star 2 even more than Starkiller Base. As for the EU's superweapons, I won't deny that there's a lot of them, but even in the few examples that Sean mentions, they are all very original and function highly different than the Death Star. Hyperspace tractor beams, particle disintegrator warheads, cracking a planet's crust with gravity manipulation, destroying solar systems. None of those things even remotely resemble what the Death Star does. But yes, there are also more examples in the EU of ships or stations with giant super lasers like the Death Star. But for one thing, 2 of the original 3 Star Wars movie plots focused on dealing with superweapons, so I'm not surprised that the EU authors would take inspiration from that. Also, this is the Empire we're talking about. I don't think they would be satisfied with just one Death Star-like superweapon. If they're going to control the galaxy through subjugation and fear, then it makes sense that they would keep pumping them out. I expect you'll see lots of them in the new canon as it develops too. Speaking of the Death Star, did you know it was secretly a sentient bounty hunter droid? In Empire Strikes Back, Darth Vader hires bounty hunters to track down the Millennium Falcon, and says he wants the rebels alive, famously telling Boba Fett, "No disintegration." Next to Fett is a weird-looking droid named IG-88. This accidentally sentient bounty hunter droid is actually kind of cool. Here's what isn't. His side story in the short story collection Tales of the Bounty Hunters, that portrays him downloading his brain into the Death Star, and a 2-bit ploy to take over the galaxy. Giving the Death Star a personality doesn't make it better. Let's all just be thankful that Lando blew it up at the end of Return of the Jedi, killing the storyline forever. IG-88 is cool, and is basically the closest we get to seeing Skynet in the Star Wars universe. He has the ability to take over other droids by uploading a program to them and having them join him in his quest to rid the galaxy of organic beings. Droids, ships, and space stations in the Star Wars universe all function on computers, obviously, which IG-88 can take over and manipulate. So, like Sean says, he downloads his brain onto the Death Star, which is understandable, since that's the most powerful superweapon at the time. But when the story came out, audiences already knew what happened to the Death Star. We were never at risk of the Death Star gaining a personality longer than the short time that IG-88 was inside of it. So really there's no need to be too upset by this story either in the grand scheme of things. Did you know someone grew a clone from Luke's severed hand? That's right. Luke's hand didn't just fall down a random shaft in the bowels of Cloud City. It was recovered by Darth Vader and eventually used to create an evil clone named Luke Skywalker. No, that's not a typo. Yeah, so? The Empire is all about making Dark Jedi clones. We see this in the Force Unleashed games and in the Riptide novel. Why wouldn't they want one of Luke? Jorah Sabayoth, a demented Dark Jedi clone himself, wanted to turn Luke to the dark side of the Force. Creating an evil clone of Luke was probably the next best thing. I think a lot of critics just like bringing this story up because Luke's clone is spelled with a second U, which is pretty easy to make fun of. Timothy Zahn could have just wrote the book and kept referring to the Luke clone as the Luke clone over and over again, and nothing about the content of the story would change. Spelling it with a second U in his name just helps differentiate which Luke was which to people who are reading it.
You know, I remember reading one theory that they've cloned Luke's hand into an evil Luke. Now, what actor doesn't want to play his own evil twin? It's a classic.
There was that one time when Luke's girlfriend had to kill him so she could date him. No, not the dead Force Ghost girlfriend who possessed one of his students, but Mara Jade, the one brainwashed by the Emperor to kill Luke Skywalker, but who accidentally fell in love with him instead. She compromised and satisfied her Skywalker bloodlust by killing off Luke instead. That's what he gets for spelling his name wrong, I guess. Silly clone. See how Sean getting hung up on that whole second U thing just demonstrates the point that I was making earlier? Also, I didn't think I'd have to defend Mara Jade's storyline, or the Thrawn trilogy, which is what many people consider to be one of the best parts of the expanded universe. But here we are. Yes, Mara Jade. One of the Emperor's hands was given a final dark side-driven telepathic command by Palpatine to kill Luke Skywalker as a final screw you to both Luke and Anakin. And through the course of one of the best storylines in all of Star Wars, Mara and Luke were forced to work together. First out of survival, then to rescue Talon Karrde, then to fight a mutual enemy. As a final screw you back at Palpatine, Mara killed the Luke clone, silencing Palpatine's last command for good, and she and Luke became friends. Luke even gave her his father's lightsaber. Years later, when the two of them were on a mission, they realized how much they cared for each other and got married soon after. I guess it's a little silly that the person who originally was so determined to kill Luke Skywalker eventually married and had a kid with him, but I think it's actually kind of sweet. I know Mara Jade has a ton of fans, so I don't think I'm in the minority on that opinion. Remember Skippy, the Force-sensitive droid? Ever wonder why the little red R5 droid Uncle Owen almost bought in A New Hope malfunctioned just in time for him to buy R2-D2 instead? Neither did anybody else. But if you really want to know, read issue 1 of the comic Star Wars Tales. Spoiler alert, it was a suicidal Jedi droid named Skippy. Okay, I actually love that last story, but it's terrible. So, Star Wars Tales was a collection of short comic stories. So short that you could fit several of them in each issue. And it was all a big mixed bag. Some stories were good, some were okay, some was just meh. Some were very serious and fit very well within the overall timeline of the EU, and some were just these silly, ridiculous, robot chicken-esque parody comics. Compared to the rest of the EU, the continuity of the Tales comics were always a big question mark, and there was never a firm statement on what was canon and what wasn't. You could probably hunt down a quote Leland Shee made on some discontinued forum from 2002 to figure out if a particular Tales comic was canon or not, but for the most part, I think you can just follow the general rule of the Tales comics. If it makes sense and fits within the timeline, it may as well be canon. If it's an overly comedic comic about a young Darth Maul running around with a lollipop, or Yoda and Mace recreating the diner scene from Pulp Fiction with Buzz Lightyear in the background, then it's probably non-canon. So with that being said, if we look at Skippy the Jedi Droid, what category do you think that might fall under? With dialogue like, they used to laugh and call him names, they never let poor Skippy join in any droid-type games, in the same panel with robots that look like Bender from Futurama, and Crow from Mystery Science Theater 3000? Do you think this story was ever meant to be official canon within the EU, or to be taken even slightly serious? This is like saying the EU was terrible, and then pointing to the Family Guy Star Wars episodes as proof. It'd be just as disingenuous if I said, the new Disney canon is garbage, because if you look at the Lego Force Awakens, how does it make any sense that the characters are made of Lego? Where does that fit within the continuity? Sean says he loves this story, though it's terrible. But this story isn't part of the EU. It's just some dumb what-if story made for fun. I've seen this story in several other lists of the worst things about the EU, but they never seem to be aware that this story was non-canon from the start. At most, in the in-universe article, Droids, Technology, and the Force, a Force-sensitive droid named Skippy was mentioned to be a wild rumor, so a wink and a nod to the audience who already knew about the story was as close to canon as Skippy was ever going to get. Sean then goes on to mention how there are good stories within the EU, like how the Thrawn trilogy, Knights of the Old Republic, and the Darth Plagueis novelization are all great stories, and I fully agree. As I stated earlier, I have no issue with Sean, and his opinions are just as valid as mine. If you look at his main complaints about the EU from my point of view, maybe you could start to see that there aren't that many reasons to think the expanded universe was as terrible as Sean laid it out to be. Was it worse than The Last Jedi? That's up for you to decide.